Hello class, welcome to Algebra Lesson 9.5, which is all about completing the square. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to use completing the square to solve quadratic equations. Alright, so let's jump right into it. Completing the square, fun fact, if you draw it out, it can look like a square. Okay, that's how it got its name. So, what value of c makes x squared plus 6x plus c a perfect square trinomial? Alright, so I have some screenshots from the book because that will allow us to kind of visualize this. So we started with x squared plus 6x plus c. We want to figure out what do we have to add to this in order to be able to make this a square. So if we use something called algebra tiles, the blue square is represented by x squared, and then the x's are represented by those green kind of tiles, those green strips, okay? And you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them to represent the 6x. And there's one of the x squareds. Okay, so if I wanted to rearrange those to make a square, I would have to take 3 of the green strips, put them here, 3 of them here, and then you can see I still have this little piece right here that is empty. So I'd want to figure out what do I have to add to this in order to make it a perfect square. You can see if I were to draw lines where each of those algebra tiles are, if I were to continue them, it would look kind of like that grid. And that grid forms 9 small squares. So that's the visual representation of completing the square. It's figuring out what you have to add to an expression to make it a perfect square. The fast way of doing this without using algebra tiles, without drawing a picture, is you take half of that middle term. So you can see they did 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Each of those is half. And sometimes you will have a number that's not a perfect integer. It'll have a decimal, okay? And that's okay. Right now we're going to start with non-decimal middle terms, though, or non-decimal things to add. So what they did was they cut that 6 in half and got 3. And then if you think about it, it was 3 squared, right? That's how we got this 9. It was a 3 by 3 square, which gives you 9. So the fast way of figuring out with drawing a picture is using this little expression here. If you take that middle term with the x, cut it in half, and then square it, you'll find out exactly what you have to add without putting drawing a picture. Okay, so then step 3, you'd write x squared plus 6x plus 9 as a binomial squared. So the way that you do that is we change it from x squared plus 6x plus 9 becomes x plus whatever that middle term is, in this case 6, cut in half, and then the squared goes on the outside. Okay? So this number right here is half of your middle term. And then you put parentheses and put a square. Okay, so down below you can see that it talks a little bit more about why this process is called completing the square. But I want you to focus on if you take that middle term, cut it in half and square it, that's the number that you will add on. Okay, so I want you to think about that when you look at this problem. What value of c makes x squared plus 12x plus c a perfect square trinomial? Good luck. All right, hopefully for this problem, you said, okay, my middle term is 12. I'm going to say 12 divided by 2. And when I say middle term, I am specifically talking about b. I should probably call that b so that way you know that it's the value with x. It's always the number that's with x. So b divided by 2 is 6. 6 squared is 36. So that's all the farther I have to go when they ask me what c is. If they were to ask me what my perfect, or how to write it as a binomial, I would change it from x squared plus 12x plus 36 and it would become x plus my half value, which is 6, squared. And that would be my final answer if they asked me to write it as a binomial. Okay? All right. So now that we know how to find that c value, let's start solving some actual equations. If you still don't feel comfortable with how to find that c, maybe rewatch, maybe look online, see if you can find more examples of how to find that c value. Because if you don't know how to find that c value, the rest of the video is not going to make sense. Okay. All right, so how can you find the solution of x squared minus 14x plus 16 equals 0? All right, so we already have something set equal to 0, which is perfect. And you might say, oh, look, we already have a trinomial. The downside is it's not a perfect square. And I know that because if I take that b value, that negative 14, cut it in half, and square it, I would get negative 7 squared, which is 49. This number is not 49, so I know it's not a perfect square trinomial. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm going to rewrite it. I'm going to leave x squared minus 14x, and then I have that plus 16. What I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 16 from both sides. I'm going to say x squared minus 14x equals a negative 16. Now that I've done that, what I do is I take that value that I found earlier by doing b divided by 2 squared, and I add that number to both sides. So I say plus 49 plus 49. Okay, so now I have x squared minus 14x plus 49 equals, and I'm just going to scroll a little bit here, equals, and then I have negative 16 plus 49, which is 33. Okay, so I'm not done quite yet. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this perfect square trinomial as a perfect square binomial. So I say x, and then remember you do minus 7. You take that half of your b value, so negative 14 divided by 2 is negative 7. Square it. Now from here, I know I can square root both sides. Square root both sides. So I have x minus 7 equals plus or minus the square root of 33. Then all I have to do is say plus 7, x equals 7 plus the square root of 33, and x equals 7 minus the square root of 33. This is another instance where you are certainly welcome to use that plus minus. If you don't like using that plus minus, you can type in 7 plus the square root of 33 and 7 minus the square root of 33. And sometimes our online book will tell you to round to the nearest hundredth. So you will have to type that into a calculator to see what the decimal version is. Okay? So make sure you kind of practice both ways. All right, I know that was a lot, so I'm going to quickly just recap those steps for you. The first thing I did was I checked to see if I had a perfect square trinomial by taking my b value, which was negative 14, dividing it by 2, which is negative 7, and squaring it, which is 49. Since the 49 did not match my c value, I knew that I needed to move the existing c value, that 16, from the left side to the right side. So then I was left with x squared minus 14x equals negative 16. Well, I wanted a perfect square trinomial. So I wanted to add that 49 to the left side, but if I add it to the left side, I have to add it to the right side. And a lot of people will forget to add it to both sides. So make sure you do add it to both the left and the right side. Then I took that perfect square trinomial, that x squared minus 14x plus 49, and I rewrote it as a perfect square binomial, so meaning the version with two terms, and that would be x minus 7, that quantity squared, and that would equal 33 at this point, because negative 16 plus 49 is 33. To undo a square, I do the square root, but if I square root one side, I have to square root the other. And I learned in past lessons that when we take the square root of a number, we have to do plus the positive version and the negative version. So now I have x minus 7 equals the positive version of the square root of 3 and the negative version of square root of 33. And the last thing I have to do to get x by itself is add 7 to both sides. So I said x equals 7 plus the square root of 3 and x equals 7 minus the square root of 3. All right. Now, it is your turn. Follow those same steps. How can you find the solution of x squared minus 8x minus 6 equals 0? Good luck. Okay, for this problem, hopefully you discovered you did not start with a perfect square trinomial, so you figured out what c value you needed by saying negative 8. So your b value divided by 2 is negative 4, and negative 4 is 16. So you moved that negative 6 to the right side by adding, so it became a positive 6. So you had x squared minus 8x equals 6. And then you added that perfect square c value, 16, to both sides. X squared minus 8x plus 16 equals 6 plus 16. Then you rewrote that perfect square trinomial as a perfect square binomial, x minus 4, quantity squared, equals 22. And then you did the square root of both sides, so you had x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 22. To get x by itself, you added 4 to both sides, so your answer was x equals 4 plus the square root of 22, or x equals 4 minus the square root of 22. If you have questions about that, please be sure to reach out for help. I am happy to help you. Let's move on to example 3. Let's practice completing the square when a does not equal 1 initially. So if you look at those last two examples, a is the number in front of x squared. So you can see there's no number listed in front of x squared. That means it's a 1. And this example, again, there was no number in front of the x squared. It was just a 1. So now we're going to practice what happens when it's not a 1 in front of our x squared. All right, the hedge has a 2-yard wide walkway. Oh, my goodness, let me try that again. The hedge has a 2-yard wide walkway. That word is tough for me today. Walkway around it. What are the dimensions of the maze? Okay, so the information we have is we have the area of the maze, which it's a rectangle. So the area of a rectangle is just length times width, right? Length times width equals the area. Okay, so that's how I'm going to model my equation. And then we know the length of the hedge maze is twice as long as the width. So I don't know what my width is, so I'm going to use W, and then my length is twice that. Okay, and then I also know that there is 2 yards in every direction, right? And this is kind of like what we practiced in the last assignment with those rectangle problems as well. So my length is 2W, but then I also have 2 here and 2 here, so that means 2W plus 4 is my length. My width is W plus, and then 2 here and 2 here, so 4. And it equals my area, 5,616 yards. So that's how I set up my problem. Before I can move on to the completing the square portion, I have to FOIL this. So I have 2W times W is 2W squared. 2W times 4 is 8W. 4 times W is 4W. And 4 times 4 is 16. All right, so hopefully you guys have kind of caught on to some of our patterns. First, I'm going to say 2W squared. I'm going to combine my middle terms. So 8W plus 4W is 12W. And then I'm going to subtract that 16 over right away because that is what we've been doing, right? We move that c term to the other side so we can add the perfect square c term into the problem. However, before you start cutting things in half and checking that middle term, you want to get so your a value equals 1. Right now, my a value is this 2. So the way that you get rid of your a value or make it 1 is you divide every single number in the equation by whatever number's in front of your squared term. So in this case, 2. So I'm going to say 2w squared divided by 2, that's just w squared, plus 12w divided by 2 is just 6w. 5,600 divided by 2 is 2,800. Now that I've cut everything in half, now I start looking for that perfect square c term. So I take my b value, cut it in half, and square it. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. So I'm going to say w squared plus 6w plus 9 equals 2,809. So I just added that 9 right in. Okay. Now that I have a perfect square trinomial on the left, I rewrite it as a perfect square binomial. So I say w plus half of b is 3 squared equals, and then I leave my 2809 for now. And I keep going from there. So to undo that square, I'm going to do the square root of both sides. So on the left, I'm left with w plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 2809. And if I plug 2809 into a square root, I see that that equals 53. Okay? Excuse me. Now I want to get w all by itself, so I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So I have negative 3 plus 53. That's w equals 50. And then I'm going to do negative 3 minus 53. W equals negative 56. Now, since I'm talking about the width of a hedge, a negative number doesn't make sense. So I'm going to get rid of that negative 56. And I know the width of the maze, or the hedge part at least, is 50 yards. However, remember there's walkways on both sides, right? We were told the width, we set it up earlier as w plus 4. So in this case, 50 plus 4, or we have a width of 54 yards. And then my length, if I plug that 50 in, I end up with 104 yards. All right. So that is the value of, or the dimensions of the maze. With the walkway, it's 54 yards, but I want 104 yards. Okay, so this process was the exact same as example 2. The only difference was I had to change that a term from a 2 to a 1 by dividing everything by 2. Let's say that a term would have been 3w squared. You would have divided everything by 3. If it was 25w squared, you would divide everything by 25. And sometimes that means you have decimals, and that's okay. I'm just using some nice numbers to help you learn this process. All right, I want you to try this problem on your own. We have the same kind of setup. The only thing that changes is instead of a 2-yard walkway around it, it is now a 1-yard walkway. Good luck. Okay, for this problem, hopefully you set it up as 2w plus 2 multiplied by w plus 2 equals 5,616. When you FOILed, you got 2w squared plus 6w plus 4 equals 5,616. Subtracted 4 from both sides to change the 5,616 to a 5,612. And then divided everything by 2, so that way you had a equal 1, or just a 1 in front of the w squared. So you had w squared plus 3w equals 2,806. And then if you cut your b value in half, that's 1.5. So I had w plus 1.5 quantity squared. But when I did 1.5 squared, that's 2.25. And so I added that to both sides. So my 2,806 became 2,808.25. Then I took the square root of both sides and did the plus or minus. I subtracted the negative 1.5 from both sides, and I was left with a positive 51.5 yards as the reasonable answer for the width. And then the length would be twice that, so 103 yards. If you have questions about that, please be sure to ask me for some help. All right, and then here on the last page, we have our concept summary to help you remember the different steps and remember all of that. So there, I shrunk it so you can take a screenshot if you would like. If you have questions about anything from today's video, please be sure to reach out and ask for some help. My students, just so you know, I'm going to post a couple of extra example videos in Google Classroom, actually probably in our team drive, to help you work through completing the square. I know it can be something that's very overwhelming, okay? So be patient with yourself, just keep practicing, and ask lots of questions. All right, have a good day.